The priestess's voice was already growing faint in the distance. Akwefi hurried to the main footpath and turned left in the direction of the voice. Her eyes were useless to her in the darkness, but she picked her way easily on the sandy footpath, hedged on either side by branches and damp leaves. She began to run, holding her breaths with her hands to stop them flapping noisily against her body. She hit her left foot against an outcropped root, and terror seized her. It was an ill omen. She ran faster, but Cielo's voice was still a long way away. Had she been running too? How could she go so fast with a zinma on her back? Although the night was cool, Akwefi was beginning to feel hot from her running. She continually ran into the luxuriant weeds and creepers that walled in the path. Once she tripped up and fell. Only then did she realize with a start that Cielo had stopped her chanting. Her heart beat violently and she stood still. Then Cielo's renewed outburst came from only a few paces ahead, but Akwefi could not see her. She shut her eyes for a while and opened them again in an effort to see, but it was useless. She could not see beyond her nose. There were no stars in the sky because there was a rain cloud. Fireflies went about with their tiny green lamps, which only made the darkness more profound. Between Cielo's outbursts, the night was alive with the shrill tremor of forest insects woven into the darkness. Akbala, duo, Akbala, Akeni, Akwefi trudged behind her, neither getting too near nor keeping too far back. She thought they must be going towards the sacred cave. Now that she walked slowly, she had time to think. What would she do when they got to the cave? She would not dare to enter. She would wait at the mouth, all alone in that fearful place. She thought of all the terrors of the night. She remembered that night long ago when she had seen Agbu Agali Odu, one of those evil essences loosed upon the world by the potent medicines which the tribe had made in the distant past against its enemies, but had now forgotten how to control. Akwefi had been returning from the stream with her mother on a dark night like this when they saw its glow as it flew in their direction. They had thrown down their water pots and lain by the roadside expecting the sinister light to descend on them and kill them. That was the only time Akwefi ever saw Agbu Agali Odu, but although it had happened so long ago, her blood still ran cold whenever she remembered that night. So it's kind of like a story about seeing a ghost or something. The priestess's voice came at longer intervals now, but its vigor was undiminished. The air was cool and damp with dew. As Zidma sneezed, Akwefi muttered, "Life to you." At the same time the priestess also said, "Life to you, my daughter." Azidma's voice from the darkness warmed her mother's heart. She trudged slowly along. And then the priestess screamed, "Somebody is walking behind me!" She said, "Whether you are spirit or man, may Akbala shave your head with a blunt razor. May he twist your neck until you see your heels." Akwefi stood rooted to the spot. One mind said to her, "Woman, go home before Akbala does you harm." But she could not. She stood until Cielo had increased the distance between them, and she began to follow again. She had already walked so long that she began to feel a slight numbness in the limbs and in the head. Then it occurred to her that they could not have been heading for the cave. They must have bypassed it long ago. They must be going toward Umwachi, the farthest village in the clan. Cielo's voice now came after long intervals. It seemed to Akwefi that the night had become a little lighter. The cloud had lifted and a few stars were out. The moon must be preparing to rise, its sullenness over. When the moon rose late in the night, people said it was refusing food, as a sullen husband refuses his wife's food when they have quarreled. Akbala duo umuwachi, Akbala akene uno. It was just as Akwefi had thought. The priestess was now saluting the village of Umuwachi. It was unbelievable, the distance they had covered. As they emerged into the open village from the narrow forest track, the darkness was softened and it became possible to see the vague shape of trees. Akwefi screwed up her eyes in an effort to see her daughter and the priestess, but whenever she thought she saw their shape, it immediately dissolved like a melting lump of darkness. She walked numbly along. Cielo's voice was now rising continuously, as when she first set out. Akwefi had a feeling of spacious openness, and she guessed they must be on the village Elo, or playground. She realized, too, with something like a jerk, that Cielo was no longer moving forward. She was in fact returning. Akwefi quickly moved away from her line of retreat. Cielo passed by, and they began to go back the way they had come. It was a long and weary journey, and Akwefi felt like a sleepwalker most of the way. The moon was definitely rising, and although it had not yet appeared on the sky, its light had already melted down the darkness. Akwefi could now discern the figure of a priestess and her burden. She slowed down her pace so as to increase the distance between them. She was afraid of what might happen if Cielo suddenly turned round and saw her. She had prayed for the moon to rise, but now she found the half-light of the incipient moon more terrifying than darkness. The world was now peopled with vague, fantastic figures that dissolved under her steady gaze, and then formed again in new shapes. At one stage, Akwefi was so afraid that she nearly called out to Cielo for companionship and human sympathy. What she had seen was the shape of a man climbing a palm tree, his head pointing to the earth and his legs skywards. But at that very moment Cielo's voice rose again in her possessed chanting, and Akwefi recoiled, because there was no humanity there. It was not the same Cielo who sat with her in the market and sometimes bought bean cakes for Zinma, whom she called her daughter. It was a different woman, the priestess of Agbala, the oracle of the hills and caves. Akwefi trudged along between two fears. The sound of her benumbed steps seemed to come from some other person walking behind her. Her arms were folded across her bare breasts. Dew fell heavily and the air was cold. She could no longer think, not even about the terrors of night. She just jogged along in a half-sleep, only waking to full life when Cielo sang. At last they took a turning and began to head for the caves. From then on, Cielo never ceased in her chanting. She greeted her god in a multitude of names: the owner of the future, the messenger of earth, the god who cut a man down when his life was sweetest to him. Akwefi was also awakened and her benumbed fears revived. The moon was now up and she could see Cielo and Azinma clearly. How a woman could carry a child of that size so easily and for so long was a miracle. But Akwefi was not thinking about that. Cielo was not a woman that night. Hagbala duo wo wo wo, Hagbala akeni yo wo wo, Chi nebu madu ubosi indu yanato ya uto dalu wo wo wo. Akwefi could already see the hills looming in the moonlight. They formed a circular ring with a break at one point, through which the foot track led to the center of the circle. As soon as the priestess stepped into this ring of hills, her voice was not only doubled in strength, but was thrown back on all sides. It was indeed the shrine of a great god. Akwefi picked her way carefully and quietly. She was already beginning to doubt the wisdom of her coming. Nothing would happen to Azinma, she thought, and if anything happened to her, could she stop it? She would not dare to enter the underground caves. Her coming was quite useless, she thought. As these things went through her mind, she did not realize how close they were to the cave mouth, and so when the priestess with Azinma on her back disappeared through a hole hardly big enough to pass a hen, Akwefi broke into a run as though to stop them. As she stood gazing at the circular darkness which had swallowed them, tears gushed from her eyes, and she swore within her that if she heard Azinma cry, she would rush into the cave to defend her against all the gods in the world. She would die with her. Having sworn that oath, she sat down on a stony ledge and waited. Her fear had vanished. She could hear the priestess's voice, all its metal taken out of it by the vast emptiness of the cave. She buried her face in her lap and waited. She did not know how long she waited. It must have been a very long time. Her back was turned on the footpath that led out of the hills. She must have heard a noise behind her and turned round sharply. A man stood there with a machete in his hand. Akwefi uttered a scream and sprang to her feet. "Don't be foolish," said Okonkwo's voice. "I thought you were going into the shrine with Cielo," he mocked. Akwefi did not answer. Tears of gratitude filled her eyes. She knew her daughter was safe. "Go home and sleep," said Okonkwo. "I shall wait here." "I shall wait too. It is almost dawn. The first cock has crowed." As they stood there together, Akwefi's mind went back to the days when they were young. She had married a Nene because Okonkwo was too poor then to marry. 2 years after her marriage to a Nene, she could bear it no longer, and she ran away to Okonkwo. It had been early in the morning. The moon was shining. She was going to the stream to fetch water. Okonkwo's house was on the way to the stream. She went in and knocked at his door, and he came out. Even in those days he was not a man of many words. He just carried her into his bed, and in the darkness began to feel around her waist for the loose end of her cloth. That's it for chapter 11. So you see in this chapter, Okwefi actually displays some characteristics of manliness in the Igbo society. She shows her courage by going after Azinma and Chielo, even though she's aware that the gods will be upset with her if she does that. Okonkwo also shows that he cares more about his family than some of the customs of his people, which really goes against his character as well. So, next time we're going to get into chapter 12 and learn even more about the Igbo people.